Good morning and welcome to the newly renovated McCall Auditorium. We are delighted to have you here. This is our first Sunday Faith Forum in the newly renovated auditorium, and we're thrilled to have Eliza Griswold as our featured speaker today. Eliza graduated from Princeton University in 1995 and studied creative writing at Johns Hopkins University. She won the Robert I. Friedman Prize in Investigative Journalism in 2004 for In the Hiding Zone about Pakistan's Waziristan Agency. She worked with a Pakistani journalist who was her handler. She's written widely on the War on Terror and published Wide Awake Field, a book of poetry in 2007. Her second book, The 10th Parallel, Dispatches from the Fault Line Between Christianity and Islam, is a travelogue about the regions around the world on the line of latitude where Christianity and Islam clash, the Philippines, Nigeria, and the Middle East and other places. In 2011, she was awarded the J. Anthony Lucas Book Prize for The 10th Parallel. In 2012, she became a Guggenheim Fellow. In 2011, in the New York Times Magazine, she published an investigative report, The Fracturing of Pennsylvania, which investigated environmentally questionable practices of fracking companies, such as Range Resources. In 2005, the New York Times Magazine wrote about the demise of Christianity in the Middle East, which is her topic today. In 2015, she translated from Pashto, I Am the Beggar of the World, Landays from Contemporary Afghanistan, which won the PEN Award for Poetry and Translation. That's P-E-N. And Eliza is the daughter of our 25th presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, who is with us this morning, Frank Griswold, and his wife, Phoebe, who grew up here. And so this is a homecoming of sorts to Eliza, whose grandparents were faithful members, and mother and relatives received their spiritual formation here in this wonderful parish. We welcome you back home, and we're grateful to have you with us as our speaker today. Join me in welcoming Eliza Griswold.
Well, thank you so much, Merrick. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here today. And I think we will, because we are among friends, we'll be a little more informal, and this will really be a conversation. I have not had the pleasure, my parents were married at St. Thomas's, and I have not had the pleasure of coming back here since my formidable grandmother's funeral. So it's very tender to be back here and very cozy and wonderful. So, in that spirit, I am going to back up a little bit today and tell you how I came to do the work that I do, because that very much informs the topic today. So, we're going to be talking about what really is happening to the Christian communities in their ancient homelands, what the word persecution means in a contemporary context, and how that word is often misused, and why it makes it difficult for more progressive Christians to really talk honestly about persecution and what that means for the Christian community today. So, but a couple of words about how I came to do what I do. I learned to read in an Episcopal church, in a very progressive setting in which the crop walk and all sorts of manners of whole wheat, organic wheat bread were sort of the Eucharist, and dad in felt stoles, and, just all one can imagine about inclusion and spirituality being grounded in ceremony, in deep ceremony. And also the idea of listening to people and speaking to people who came from different faith traditions was just what happened around the butcher block kitchen table, which, by the time we left the rectory in Philadelphia had IKEA legs kind of propping it up, and there was always something in the crock pot and always some loony coming in the back door. I'll share this. This is my especially important experience when the rectory was such a porous space when I was little on St. Martin's Lane in Chestnut Hill that once we came back and found a robber in our home because the doors weren't locked, and he was wearing a blue blazer, and I was with Mom, and he came down. He was on the second floor of the house, and he came down, and he said, oh, isn't this Chestnut Hill College? I mean, clearly not, right? And Mom was like, no, I'm sorry, it isn't. And rushed upstairs to see if anything had been taken. I mean, that sort of defines this inclusive childhood where even the robber is greeted with politeness, So anyway, what came for me out of that experience was a lot of really deep respect for people of deep, deep, deep faith, where the idea of faith and intellect were not in competition with one another. And also the reality that Americans deeply held religious beliefs, smart Americans that you saw every day doing this and that, and those beliefs were very tender and dear to them, was something that I knew. So when I became a journalist actually in early 2001. I did my first story on Islam and human rights for the New Republic. I had just set out as an independent journalist, and I sold that story again to the London Sunday Times probably in July of 2001. And then I was walking in Central Park with my sister on the morning of September 11th, and we heard the sirens and came to understand vaguely what had happened. And I had just done my story for the first time for the London Sunday Times. So I called up my editor and said, you guys are in London. Do you need a stringer? Do you need a daily reporter here in New York? And the answer was yes. And 2 weeks later, I was in Pakistan with my sneakers with the, dust from the trade centers and the treads. And basically, that's it. I haven't looked back, and that was 15 years ago. And I'm part of an entire generation of foreign correspondents who are really forged in that experience. So what I saw going on as for the mainstream publications I write for the secular publications, for the New York Times, for the New Yorker, for the Atlantic, for Harper's, was that in these editorial spaces there was no literacy about what religion meant at all, and a very veiled contempt for belief. Because the understanding was, as largely has been our urban, intellectual tradition, that we are growing out of the idea of God. That God, faith, that there's something retro everything about being a believer. And so in the editorial office where I was a young reporter, it was, those people who are blowing things up, they don't really believe in anything. That's not religion. And that became an easy argument that we certainly still hear today, which is, and it can be quite a dangerous one, that true religion is not violent. True religion is one thing. And anything that claims that true religion is one thing is in itself suspect. Because religion is large enough to contain many expressions. And as we have really learned, I think, in the beginning when I would do this work, I would find myself laying out the very basic tenets of Islam, the very basic understanding that, for his time, Muhammad set down the most progressive legal codes in history, that for his time, he allowed women to get a divorce, to hold property. Within Islam, Muhammad was the first to lay down codes that said female infanticide, killing your girl babies, was illegal. So now, but how can we own a totality of faith expressions? And so I think now we have come to understand there is no such thing as Islam. There are many Islams. The same thing is true within a Christian context. And we certainly see that when we hear people who hold different understandings of what it means to be a believer, express those, and they say, wow, that sounds militant. That sounds so angry. How can that person call him or herself a Christian? And really, how can we broaden our definitions of what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be a Muslim, not in some relative way, to say, oh, everybody believes what they believe, that's not a problem. No, but to accept the reality and the plurality as faith is expressed on the ground. So most of my work for the past 15 years, I've been really a translator of sorts. I've gone places and learned from people about why they believe what they believe, what they've done in the name of religion, acts of extreme bravery, extreme peace, and extreme violence as they understand themselves to be following God's will, and to bring those beliefs back to other communities. And so a lot of the reason that I wrote this first book, this book about Christianity and Islam in Africa and Asia, was that we were seeing a lot of violence in Africa, in Nigeria especially, perpetrated by Christians. And yet that story of Christians seeing themselves as Christian soldiers surrounding a little Muslim town called Wase, massacring 900 Muslims within that town, we weren't hearing that story. We were hearing, look how violent Islam is. So, again, one of really what I see as my central duties is to bring back the differences of what it means to be a Christian and how people see that practiced around the world, especially in communities that believe themselves to be embattled. Okay, so this is really the foundation of how I came to do the work that was in the New York Times that I'm going to be talking about today. What does it mean to be an embattled Christian? So, just to start, I'm afraid I'm going to put my dad on the spot because we had a reading today from Timothy, which was Paul, I guess. Okay, Dad, would you talk about that letter a little bit? Because I was reading it as it was being read, and this is martyrdom, right? We're hearing Paul talk about no one's coming to help me. I'm being thrown to the lions, and the Lord protects me. Is that right? So that was Paul's letter? Okay. So I read that letter as a complaint. Paul was like, well, you guys didn't come help me, but I was okay because God was here. So what does this mean? So we know this, right? For most of us, this is a critique that many Christians who live in embattled Christian communities around the world would call us sitting today here SUV Christians. SUV Christians ride their SUVs to church on Sunday, but do they live their faith? Do they really think about what it means to be a Christian? Not really. That's a critique I've heard many, many times. And it's also a really important worldview, because when we hear about the hostility to homosexuality in much of the Christian world, and we think, well, how can African Christians be willing to put homosexuals to death? What is this about? This comes directly out of the sense of living an embattled faith today. That for many Christians around the world, the idea of being a martyr, of living and dying for professing your faith, is not an abstraction. It's not a metaphor. It's not a biblical story that can be tied into a historical context. It's a daily reality. And it is how many of them perceive their lives. And out of that understanding of being embattled, many of the forms of Christianity that these communities take are hard for us to take. How can you say you're really a Christian soldier? How can you be willing to kill someone and call yourself a Christian? I'm not here to defend that. I'm here to explain it a little bit, to unpack it, so that we can understand when we read the news about people who believe in a Christian or Muslim context, in other places, when you believe you are living and dying for your faith, what does that mean? And how does that broaden one's worldview and sharpen it and divide it? So many of the Christians, though, who live in embattled reality today are not militant. And so I'm going to focus my story today about what it means to be a Christian in the contemporary Middle East. Many people who are not fighting at all, who are simply dying and fleeing. So In the program, I had told Merrick that I was going to be just back from Gaza, just back from the Gaza Strip. And I didn't end up taking that trip because I've been working on this project you heard mentioned about fracking. So I just finished a fracking book. So I'm going to keep my comments to my work on ISIS. What is it that ISIS is doing to minority communities of Christians and Yazidis and other indigenous faiths in Syria and Iraq? And I'm going to keep those comments brief, and you guys can ask me questions and we can talk about that a little bit, right? And how does what's happening to these Christian minorities represent the larger tectonic plates of shifting and hardening of religious belief in the contemporary Middle East, okay? So to step back just a little bit, let's step back before ISIS. Let's step back to the devolution, the collapse of national boundaries, which in the Middle East have been irrelevant from the beginning, right? So national identity means very little. Religious identity means a great deal. So we understand the basics of how ISIS came to be, that I don't want to bore people with too much politics here. So in very short form, and I can slow this down if necessary. I'll look to my mom. She told me if I went too fast, she'd give me a high sign. Very broad, brief terms, right? The problems for Christians in Iraq began, as they will tell you, really with the U.S. invasion, not with ISIS. Because when we invaded in 2003, ironically, at the hands of George Bush, an evangelical Christian, that the first victims, the easiest scapegoats for people angry about that invasion were Christians. Iraqi Christians. So when the U.S. invasion happened in Iraq, there are about this is a slightly high number, but about 1.5 million Iraqi Christians before the U.S. invasion. Within the few years following that invasion, more than 1 million fled. They became the scapegoats not only of local anger at a U.S. occupation, which perceives the West as Christian. Those Christian communities tended to be quite wealthy, so they were the best people to kidnap. Many of those kidnappers cast themselves as Al-Qaeda, right? Because that was a convenient label to be. So these Christian communities in Iraq found themselves absolutely embattled. So we're not hearing too much of that in the West from 2003, 2005 to, 2014. But that's what was going on. So we have hundreds of thousands, more than 1 million Iraqi Christians leaving, and those who remain moving a little bit north to towns in Mosul, moving to Mosul, which was historically quite Christian, moving to Kirkuk, moving north where there was safety in Kurdistan in northern Iraq. So then we have, on top of that, we have the rise of ISIS, right? We have, as many of us have heard, we have Paul Bremer, who's the administrator in charge of Iraq during the U.S. occupation. What does he do with all the Baathists? What does he do with Saddam's guys, with Saddam's military? He sends them home, right? They have no jobs. They have no prospects. What do? Many of them form Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. And then out of that group, we have ISIS, right? We have people who and again, is it just about jobs? Is it just a matter of political and social economy? It is not. But we have people as an opportunistic identity. We have the rise of ISIS, right? First in Iraq and then in Syria as they spread over the border, and the very peaceful revolution, the uprising against Assad in Syria becomes chaos as Assad responds really with genocide. Okay, so what's happening now as ISIS begins? Well, they start terrorizing the Christians and the Yazidis, who follow basically they're Zoroastrian. They follow an ancient tradition older than Christianity, and they've been in Iraq and in Syria for thousands and thousands of years. So ISIS begins to take over villages, it's about land. So ISIS is trying to take over these villages and terrorize the Christian communities. And we have heard some of the horrible, horrible things that ISIS has done to Yazidi young women. So ISIS seized 6,700 Yazidi women. They currently hold 3,700. I had the privilege of sitting with a young Yazidi woman a couple of weeks ago named Noria. Is that right? No, Nadia, and she is suing ISIS in the International Criminal Court for taking 18 members of her family. And she was, I'm just scanning for little tiny ears, but I'm not seeing any children in this room. Is anybody sitting next to a small person? If you are, could you? No. Okay. So she was, over a 3-month period, gang raped, burned with cigarettes, watched as the girls around her commit suicide, often drinking any kind of household poison they could get their hands on. She watched her mother shot in front of her because her mother was deemed too old to be a sex slave. And still this is happening today, ISIS trades these young Yazidi girls who are deemed to be non-Muslim. They trade them over Facebook. They trade them over WhatsApp, which is one of the messaging services they use quite a bit. They sell them to one another. And they also taunt family members by sending pictures of their girls. And ISIS took very, very small Christian and Yazidi boys to make them soldiers. And seeing these pictures will just make you sick, because what they do is take 1-year-old, 2-year-old boys and dress them up in tiny fatigues and have them raise their finger, which is the ISIS salute, smile, and then they send those pictures to their Christian and Yazidi parents. So it's truly horrifying. So you have Christians literally being crucified right now in Syria and Iraq, right? Does ISIS understand what they're doing by using those expressions? Absolutely 1,000%. It's a form of propaganda. It's a form of re-engendering this sense that Christianity and Islam are in an inexorable clash of civilizations to the end of time. So one of the things that happened, you guys are going to hear in the news now about a little Christian town called Karakosh. In Iraq, it was the biggest Christian town there was, and the Iraqis just took Karakosh back from ISIS yesterday. They were in Karakosh. So again, we had ISIS round up an entire town of Christians. Most of the Christians had fled, because anybody who could get out of town ran. But who does that leave behind? The people mentally ill. Anybody whose family wasn't able to help them, the elderly, children. And I met with a woman. All the people left were rounded up in this town and they were put on buses. It's directly out of, it's a Holocaust. Rounded up, divided, culled from one and the other. You are useful to us because you're strong, or you're a young girl and we can do what we want with you. And you are not useful to us because you're old or you're weak. The youngest person they took from this town was a 3-year-old girl. And she has not been heard from since. So I say this because it's really important for us to hear. Okay, it's uncomfortable for the media, and I belong to this group, to talk about Christianity and Islam, especially Christianity, without falling into what feels like a trap from the Christian right. Like, I'm going to talk about Christians and that's somehow divisive. So we hear somewhat about the Yazidi people, yes, about really a genocide, about a concerted effort on behalf of ISIS to wipe the Yazidi people off the face of the planet. And gang rape is one of those tactics, because you impregnate these girls and the children they have are no longer Yazidi. That's a deliberate tactic. This is also happening with Christians, and we hear less of that. And so I felt, as a journalist, although it's an uncomfortable subject for many to talk about, that it was really my duty to go look at what ISIS was doing with Christian communities in Syria and Iraq. So this is now, okay, so that's a little bit of what it's like on the ground. To step back historically and politically, to give a little bit of context of why are Christian communities, not only in Syria and Iraq, where they're facing ISIS, but in Palestine, in Egypt, in other ancient communities of Christians, why are they embattled? Why are they leaving these ancient homelands? And that isn't just a matter of religion. That is a matter of political economy a bit. So Christians in the Middle East as minority communities, before the Arab Spring, the military dictators in the Middle East, whether we're talking about Assad in Syria or we're talking about Mubarak in Egypt, they needed the Christians, or we're talking about Saddam Hussein. These guys, as terrible as they were, in order to hold their grip on political power, they shored up wealthy minority communities under them, right? And Christian communities in the Middle East belong to that wealthy minority group. And so many Christians in the Middle East, whether they were Egyptian or whether they were Syrian or whether they were Iraqi, by proxy backed these military dictators. It wasn't that they strongly adhered necessarily to their Ba'athist or whatever their political position was. It was that they found safe haven under these military leaders. So with the Arab Spring, here, in the West, we had this hopeful moment of, wow, across the Middle East, we're going to have upspringing of democracy, and wow, it's going to be fantastic. And we didn't account for many factors. One of the factors we didn't account for is that violent political expression, that democracy wasn't going to look like what we wanted it to look like. That democracy and the plethora of positions isn't necessarily how we see them here. On top of which, we didn't think about the blowback against these minority communities. So that's largely, we have a whole Coptic, what's happening to Egyptian Christians, although I won't be talking about it today because I haven't reported on it in detail at all, is truly stunning. Because again, Christians become both a local proxy, because they were the wealthy people for a long time and they're the other, and a global proxy for the West. So if you cannot reach an American soldier in Iraq, you might just go kill your Christian neighbor, because the perception is that Christianity comes from the West, which for many Middle Eastern Christians is doubly troubling. Because they belong to communities that have been Christian before there was a West, and they perceive the West to have abandoned them, right? So for Iraqi Christians, this is especially profound, because the idea that George Bush, having such effervescent and vocal expressions of his faith, would in fact put into play the systems that have really led to their exodus, and that the West does nothing. Like, here we are Christians, and the West does nothing for us. And that's true. And that's not only true under George Bush, that's true under President Obama as well. Like, for instance, I'm going to finish with this, and then you guys can ask some questions. So, or have comments. Which typically I do not invite comments, but from this crew, I think it'd be good. Okay, so President Obama, and his political adversaries make a lot of this, right? The fact that he won't say radical Islamist terrorist, for one. The fact that he called ISIS JV, right? They're JV. We don't need to take them seriously. Obama has consistently underplayed the threat and reality of radical Islamist terrorists, abroad, right? Because politically, what happens is a couple of things. He is afraid to play into the hands of the Christian right. And this gets a little more complicated, but the Christian right makes quite a big deal about persecution of Christians worldwide, right? Because it's a way to shore up their base, right? Is this familiar to people? Yeah? Okay. All right. So one of the things that's happening to Middle Eastern Christians, though, is that they are being let down by the Christian right also. Why? Because many members of the Christian right do not perceive the kind of Christianity, these ancient forms of Christianity, to be legitimate forms of Christianity. Because, and again, I want to be very careful with language here because all of these terms are contested, right? For many members of the Christian right, one must have a born-again faith basis. You must have accepted Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior to be an authentic Christian. And for, these ancient traditions, that doesn't exist at all. Like that, what are you talking about, Jesus Christ? And so these smoky old monks, with their long beards in a Syrian monastery who, stink of incense and, are smoking cigarettes, they are not seen as legitimate Christians within a Western context, and so they are largely abandoned, which makes it incredibly complicated. And this gets even more complicated on the issue of Israel, because Palestinian Christians, through this lens of the Christian right, are first and foremost Palestinians, and so they themselves are abandoned. So these are difficult terms, and we can talk about them, we can unpack them a little bit if that's helpful. So where we've seen Obama really fail the Christian communities in the Middle East is this reluctance to talk about religion at all. So, for instance, when ISIS put to death a number of Ethiopian Christians in Libya, and this was one of their early large PR stunts, they put the guys, as Al-Qaeda did this too, they've taken the jumpsuit back, right? They've taken the orange jumpsuit from Guantanamo, and now they put their victims in jumpsuits. So they lined up all of these Ethiopian Christians in orange jumpsuits, and they beheaded them on a beach, and they filmed this, and it was one of their first real, it could not have been gorier. And where the United States usually comes out, when something like that happens, the State Department, so it falls under Kerry, will usually say something about the minority community, like this minority community has been targeted, right? No mention of Christians, just Ethiopians. And again, although we don't hear that in our news cycle is busy, it goes on. For Christians in the Middle East, that was like, you betray us yet again. That we are being killed for this identity, and you are erasing us from the earth just as ISIS is. So that gives you a little bit of sense of how those two things can play both ways. And then we had there was a ton of pressure, again, beyond the headlines, from the Middle Eastern Christian community to when Kerry said that ISIS was committing a genocide, when he made that announcement, last year, there was a ton of pressure. He was just going to say a genocide against the Yazidi people. It was going to be, the Christians were, again, going to be left out of it. And there was a ton of lobbying from the Christian community in Washington saying, do not leave us out again. Do not leave us out. Because that has real implications under international law, right? That's this young Yazidi woman who I met with, who's trying to take ISIS to the International Criminal Court, which is obviously not going to happen anytime soon. But if ISIS members do end up at The Hague, the legal definitions of who they've killed and why need to clearly encompass all minorities in the Middle East. So that was a big victory for Christians in the Middle East when Kerry included them in this definition of genocide. And it wasn't going to happen. It was a really contested. So that's how Washington fits in a little bit. The politics of Washington's uncomfortableness with the terms of religion, that's a little bit how that blows back against Christian communities in Syria, in Palestine, in Iraq, and the larger Middle East. So that was like a walk through 2,000 years of history and about 40,000 square miles at least. So from that, though, I hope that I've introduced a little bit of how we can look at the lens of people who seem so different from us and call themselves Christian and perceive themselves to be persecuted, martyrs. How can those terms be valid and authentic today in this context? And how can we accept them and help support people who are human beings? So, okay. I think with that, I will just open for some questions. Yeah?
Let me just say, we keep your questions about two sentences rather than statements so that we can hear from Eliza.
Yeah.
When Malachi was prime minister,
Yeah.
he went out of his way to exclude Sunnis.
Yeah.
What did he do about the Christian community out of the way?
That's such a good question. So this question touches on an essential reality of the Middle East today, which is that Maliki, when he was in charge of Iraq, further marginalized the Sunni community by making no space for them in the government and basically taking things from them. And so part, without question, of the responsibility for the formation and creation of ISIS lies with Maliki's government. So what did he do for Christian minorities? Nothing. He essentially ignored them. And by that time, so many had left Baghdad, so many had fled to the north. One of the things that underlies, so we have heard a lot about the Nineveh Plain. Yeah, this area that lies between north and south, which is where Jonah and the whale, the story of Jonah and the whale comes from Nineveh. Like, you're like, wait, what? Like, that's one of the most powerful things. And I don't know how many of you guys have had the chance to go to Palestine to sort of visit some of these ancient places, but it's really, truly mind-bending to be in these ancient Christian communities. So under Maliki, this political exodus continued. So Christian political interests were essentially ignored. So they had no place in the political system, which is something they're hoping for, that post-ISIS, they will have their own governorate. They will essentially have a little state, a minority state that will have a place in front of a legislative role, a legislative voice, because they've been both politically marginalized and economically marginalized under Maliki. But he hasn't targeted them, if that makes a little more clear. But the other essential thing what are we seeing? What are we seeing in the Middle East? We are seeing a total breakdown of the map, and we are seeing the formation of ethno-religious states. So yes, Christians are embattled, and Christians are victims of this larger Shia-Sunni confrontation that we are really watching with ISIS the formation of a Sunni heartland. We are seeing new states form that I think we're going to be seeing for the next few decades. Yeah.
How did the Christian people in the Middle East come to be the wealthier residents?
That's another fantastic question. How did the Christians in the Middle East come to be wealthier? Partly, actually, because of the missionary tradition, because they were better educated. So in many of the places, Lebanon, for instance, the strong history of education and missionary education led them to both have more wealth locally and also to be able to have more of a global. They spoke English, right? They could trade with other people. They became doctors. Pathways toward global involvement were open to the Christians. And that's an essential reason they're leaving the Middle East. They are more able to move, right? That's something we don't talk about in Syria, which is really, really important. The people who are left behind in Syria are the people who cannot afford to leave. Right? So people who can leave first. And the Christian communities in the Middle East, and certainly in Syria and Iraq, it tended to be those who had the means to do so. Yeah.
Can this problem be solved?
What a great... Thank you, Mr. Stanley. What a great question. I just saw you in church, and it just made me smile so hugely and think about being on a go-kart with Leisha in the woods behind your house, and we got the worst shock. We thought we almost electrocuted ourselves, but we didn't ever tell anybody. We were like, don't tell anybody. We're never going to be allowed on this go-kart again. Can this problem be solved? Okay. The real question is, along those lines, is will anyone want to go back? Why would anybody go back to a community where they have nothing left? And is there a role for the West in a reconstruction that makes it more that makes it possible for people to return. And that has different pieces to it. First of all, there's a generational gap. Like, if you go to northern Iraq today and you go sit in, the local cafe, and you've got Christian kids there, they want to leave. They have no reason to stay. The older people tend to want to stay. We had a home. Of course, they have a historical memory, and the young have no memory. So in order to safeguard these ancient communities, a post-ISIS Iraq, I'm going to stay with that because it's a little bit easier to define what that might look like, because Syria is just too much of a disaster. A post-ISIS Iraq, to return to this idea of governorate. The minority communities who are most imperiled by ISIS, before ISIS, had no role in the political system. And they did have money, but they had no, for instance, they weren't in charge of their budget for like running electricity. That was from Baghdad. And the area that they're in was contested between the Kurds who live in the north and the Arabs who live in the south. So they lived in land that was a kind of a no man's land. So what they would like, this is speaking for a Yazidi community and a Christian community, but the minorities, I think, is totally fair to say. What they would like is their own zone. We sometimes hear safe zone, right? They'd like their own budget. They want to be part of the Iraqi government. Like, they want to go to parliament. They want to have their own representation. And certain things are definitely off the table. The United States is not going to support any kind of no-fly zone for minorities in Iraq. Post-ISIS. No way. We can't afford it. And as we have been hearing through the election, a no-fly zone brings in the issue of, are we going to end up going to war by mistake? Right? So they really want a no-fly zone. They really want international troops protecting them, and they're not going to get either one. Is there a way in which minority communities in Iraq could be part of kind of like a national guard, where they could have a larger political stake and because right now in this battle for Mosul, you've got renegade bands of armed guys who believe they're defending their own people, right? They aren't integrated either into the Kurdish Peshmerga system in the north or into the Baghdad Iraqi army. And that makes them dangerous. So if there is a life for minorities in Iraq after ISIS leaves, it will be being both part of the political and part of the military system. It'll be integration. And they're going to have to know they're safe in order to go back, because they've lost everything. So that is one very specific answer to what a U.S. role might look like, which is putting pressure on the Iraqi government to actually make this like mini governorate. There are already 48 governorates. It's like us being a state, like a U.S. state. So there's already the political cycle. There's already the political infrastructure in place to make this possible, but it will take some oversight from us to make it happen. But that's just that's for one community. Yeah.
If you don't mind talking about the issues.
Yeah.
Give us just a little insight. How do you do what you do? How do you keep yourself safe? How do you communicate with these people?
Sure.
In your community? Do they trust you?
Yeah.
Just a little insight.
Sure. That has definitely changed over time. I have a 3-year-old now, so when I was younger and when I was writing this book, this 10th Parallel, I really just set out to travel over 2 continents and 9 countries and on my own. On my own, though, that's the misperception, and this is probably helpful to understand what journalists have going on every day, which is we work with a local journalist, usually, or a local human rights advocate, or a translator. So when I'm in Iraq now, first of all, northern Iraq is quite safe. You can go right up to the front line and you can look through binoculars and there are ISIS's black flags. Obviously today that's different, right? But 2 months ago, the front line was stable, a stable entity. So you go, okay, so long time ago, I would do it a little differently. I would find a local community. I would go report with them. I'd gather their stories. I'd get a driver and a translator, and that was different. Now, for the working on the Christians in the Middle East story, I contacted minority Christian communities in Iraq. I had a wonderful young man who is my translator, who's just hilarious. I wish I could tell you the things he says in English, but he'd learned to speak English from watching like X-rated American comedians, like people I don't even know who they are, but like and then we would laugh for hours because he would just throw these things off. But maybe I could. There's one very sweet story that I think is important to understand. To get these, okay, so we were at a checkpoint, and his name is Hora, which is in Assyrian Christian, it's John. It translates to John. And so the Kurdish soldier, the Peshmerga guy who checked his passport, said, John, that's a very old name, right? Because that's an ancient community. And he said, a very old name for a very young man. And John said, what do you want my name to be? Facebook? Right? I mean, right? So you just, that sort of blending of identity, is happening all the time. So it is very possible, it's very possible for people who are interested in this issue to travel absolutely to Israel, Palestine, to travel, to meet people who live in Turkey, Lebanon. You can go talk to these communities, and it's not so very dangerous, and it's really important. So, for instance, that story I was telling you guys about the people in that Christian town who were put on the buses, rounded up and put on the buses, driven out of town. One bus turned left, went to Mosul. Those people have never been heard from again. One bus went right and came to Kurdistan because it was the old people. They basically pushed them off the bus in the desert and they walked. Nobody knew that story. Nobody knew about those buses. I learned about the buses in a refugee camp from one person who'd been on them. And then I spent the next 2 weeks saying, do you know about who was on the buses? And then just trying to reassemble the story of what had happened for a magazine, for the Times, but also with the understanding of, like, here's the historical record of how the last Christian town in Iraq fell and may never be Christian again. Yeah. Yeah.
You speak of a post-ISIS Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
While obviously that is going to happen for this,
Mm-hmm.
what do you do about the ideology?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It doesn't seem to me that this is going to be very easy.
Absolutely not. And, not only is it not going to be tamed, but it has morphed and it is among us in ways that how do we own that reality without doing our own form of persecution and profiling, right? Like here at home. And I thought that Hillary Clinton said the best thing about it. I mean, she has consistently said this thing that what we really need is the help from American Muslims, and I was thinking, so actually, I'm up at the Harvard Divinity School right now, and a woman up there was saying last week, a woman who's German, she was saying Germany how did the ISIS guys get caught in Germany? Another Syrian ratted them out, right? Like, here is how this process works. So do I think the ideology is dying? I don't at all. I don't at all. I think nowhere is it dying. And I don't know. I mean, politically, it will look like ISIS is gone. What their new mutation will be, I have no idea. And tomorrow, what will happen over the border in Syria, which is, those questions have become unanswerable. And I also do believe that Obama, the biggest black eye of his administration, his Rwanda will be his failure to act in Syria. Of course, it's easy to say, well, what could he have done? And that's not for me to answer, but something is the answer. Yeah. That's another terrific question. So many of the Jewish communities are already gone. I remember being in Libya a few years ago. You see them if you're in Libya, if you're in Tunisia, Iraq, the synagogues, and there's nobody there. right? Like sometimes there's one old caretaker, but many Middle Eastern Jews will say, you guys are outside of Israel, obviously, but you guys are the Christian community, we were the canaries in the coal mine, right? And now you guys are next. And the Christians will say, we are the canaries in the coal mine. We are the death of plurality in the Middle East, and nobody is doing anything. And in some cases, certainly in Israel, Palestine, where the Palestinian Christians often serve as buffers between both sides, one of the fears is, and Lebanon, this is absolutely true, as Christians leave the Middle East and we see these hardening of tectonic plates, whether they're Shia Sunni or they have other identities to them, Christians did used to serve as the buffers. And when they're gone, what will that lead to? Maybe we have time. Oh, geez. Are you sure back there? I can just answer it in the car in a few minutes. Thanks for your comment. Okay, the only other thing I want to say, because I have a personal stake in this, is what else can we do? We can be welcoming to Syrian refugees, and we can really make that a reality. Canadians do such a wonderful job sponsoring and welcoming Syrian refugees. There's no reason we can't do that on an individual basis. If anybody wants to, I am in touch with a Syrian family who just arrived and a couple of excellent community-based Syrian NGOs. So if that's an area of interest for you, please let me know, and I could put you in touch with the people who are really doing great work.
Eliza, thank you so very much. That was profound and really so stimulating. We want to take you up on that offer. Let's be in touch about that, because I think we need to do that, folks. Take one family, support them in every way we can. I know St. Martin in the Field is doing that, and I think it's the least we can do with this kind of worldwide situation. I want to let you know I failed to acknowledge that you're a fellow at the Harvard Divinity School and also teach at Columbia University. You do an incredible thing. I just want to let you know also that I'll be leading a pilgrimage to the Holy Land in November of this coming year. So Cuba in February or March, and the Holy Land in November. So if you're interested, please let me know. Thank you for being here. We also have Rabbi Marks coming. I believe it's in February. He'll be speaking about the resurgence of Gnosticism and dualism in our society and also around the world. This sense of I am this, you are that, we are worlds apart, and I'll kill you if need be. This topic, which we got deep into today, he'll be continuing that conversation. It's near and dear to his heart as well. Thank you for your time, and let us work together to make this a safer, better world. God bless you.